Hello and welcome back, and before we start today's video on the subject of ransomware, a quick thing straight off the bat. If you are watching this and you have not been hit by any kind of ransomware right now, and you don't have your most important data, your photos and video, backed up to at least one other location, stop watching. I'd love for you to watch this video, but every second you're not doing that, your data is basically vulnerable. So if your data is in a NAS server of any brand or name, but you don't have it in another location, and that is to say you've taken a little photo, sent it to the NAS and deleted it from your photo, and therefore it is the only copy of that file out there, and it's really, really important to you, stop watching. Go get yourself a USB to back it up onto, back it onto a cloud server from Google or Microsoft, get another NAS and back it up that way, but for God's sake, get your data backed up. Run the intro. Hello, and yes, that is right. Deadbolt has attacked QNAP again. It seems to be something we talk about now, at least in 2022, at least once every few months, like 2 to 3 months. I think this is now the third, possibly 3.5, depending on how you measure these things, attack of QNAP as a brand and their servers by the Deadbolt Ransomware Group. And in today's video, a little bit of it at the top there, we are going to talk about the nature of the latest attack reported via Photo Station, a QNAP application on the 3rd of September. But the greater portion of this video is going to be about Deadbolt more than anything else, and why QNAP is a target, how much of this is their responsibility, how much is the end user's responsibility, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a better understanding of the nature of these things, and particularly the nature of how these things are being perceived. But onto the current nature of events. That's right, Deadbolt has been reported to attack QNAP NASs that are utilizing two clear vectors. One, that they have Photo Station, even the latest version as of before the 3rd of September installed, and that version up until the update when QNAP rolled out a patch for that closed the exploit. If you were utilizing Photo Station and this is the really important bit, you had unsecured external access to the NAS, then you were, or if you are watching this, perhaps you are a victim of the ransomware known as Deadbolt. That is when a command is injected into the QNAP NAS system remotely to the NAS, execute a command where it starts encrypting, archiving all of the data inside, and then after that, it doesn't leave anything, it doesn't leave any traces, it's not like a malware or a virus, but it leaves a note, a .txt type document detailing that you have been hit by ransomware, and it has an address with which you you say donate, nearly said that, they take by extortion a sum of 0.05 Bitcoin, which is just sub a grand, under a grand or so, and from there you get the key to unlock it. It also changes the GUI login page for your QNAP to display a message there directing you. There's also a message on there they've done to QNAP saying, "I'll give us," I think it's 50, or it might be 5 Bitcoin now, for details on the exploit, and a master key to encrypt it for everyone. That's basically the nature of it. But when it comes to how this attack happens, it's pretty similar to other Deadbolt attacks before it, insofar as it gets inside your system. It utilizes a very specific encryption, which has changed as of May. Apparently there were reports on a few websites there which were detailing how the encryption algorithm had been increased, and as well as changes in the ransom note as well. But ultimately the methodology has largely stayed the same, and an exploit on the NAS, but an exploit on the NAS that needs to be able to be accessed externally in order to get through the exploit into the system and execute that encryption and that archival of all the data inside there. Now, right now, as it stands, it has been completely patched. Within, I think it was 12 hours, QNAP was saying, they issued a firmware patch for Photo Station on all of their platforms, QTS and QUTS in both version 5 and the subdivisions underneath that. And if you installed that, that closed the vulnerability there. But this doesn't really address the wider issue there with regards to Deadbolt, the ransomware attacking with the severity that it has done in 2022, and specifically with QNAP as a target there. So for now, let's talk about why Deadbolt is still around. Now, as mentioned, Deadbolt is utilizing a vulnerability at least in this instance, within Photo Station. But previously, after, without no true 100% confirmation there, it was seeming that Deadbolt was able to take advantage of vulnerabilities in the Linux build of QTS. Now, why is that important? Well, twofold. One, pretty much everything these days that you utilize is built from just a handful of different programs and coding languages, all the way down to the ground. And Linux is everywhere. And that's not just QNAP either. It is all over the shop. And often, Linux themselves are the ones that have to patch vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities, once patched, obviously people that utilize these then have to involve and roll out their own patches based on that framework. That can often mean a delay. When a vulnerability is found within a certain kernel of Linux, it needs to be imposed into later software revisions that are built on that. But really, once again, focusing there on Deadbolt, the issue here is not so much about Linux per se. It is about the vulnerability, the opening. By that, what I mean is, think of your house. Your house has a front door. Maybe you've got a big old lock there on the front door. Maybe you've got a little chain. You maybe got several locks. I don't know where you live. But inside your house, you have multiple doors. You have multiple cupboards. You have all kinds of stuff there. Some of which you might lock, because maybe it's that private drawer that you don't want anyone to go in. But ultimately, the big focus for you most of the time is the front door, that big door on the externals. That is where your security is, and that's the ones you care about the most. You might have internal locking mechanisms in your house for doors, but they'll be nowhere near as sturdy as that front door, and in most cases, very few of us actually have locks aside from the lock on the inside of our bathroom. And the same methodology, and although it does seem like a tenuous and stretched metaphor there, or simile, when it comes to how these ransomwares attack our NAS systems, the vulnerabilities built into these applications themselves aren't the big problem. They are problematic, and we will come to the subject of updates later on, but the real problem is the door, the main doorway, and how we are utilizing NAS systems and not thinking enough about the front door there. Now, most when it comes to ransomware, malware, any of these attacks that have happened on any NAS device, and I'm not just focusing on QNAP with this one, but all NAS brands and indeed all software out there, and I will talk about that a little bit more later on, need two things to work. They need the weakness and they need the opportunity. And too much people focus on the weakness and not the opportunity. So, to put it into perspective, this year in 2022, we're just at the start of the 9th month of the year, Microsoft and their software platform has reported 671 individual vulnerabilities. Even Synology have reported 22. iOS, so Apple for the mobile there, has reported 79. And indeed, all the NAS brands and a lot of server and even your Dropbox, your Google Drive, all of those with their client applications have reported vulnerabilities there. Now, the nature of that is that when a vulnerability is either notified or made, the brand themselves, whoever they are made aware of this, or end user base volunteer it, sometimes in bounty and reward systems, it is reported online, and then that vulnerability is closed with an update. So a lot of the time, the onus is on you, the end user, to do an update. In some cases, it's automated, depending on the platform you go for. If you look at Xbox and PlayStation, stuff like that, a lot of the time, when their security updates go out, a lot of them are compulsory, and if you don't install them, you can't access online services there. That's a very extreme approach there. Not everyone's in love with it, and we will touch on that later on. But when it comes to the nature of software development and these nefarious individuals that are trying to take advantage of it, the issue is about staying one step ahead. And unfortunately, all the bad guys have to do is stay one step ahead. The good guys don't know about the vulnerability, because how many test scenarios can you run? Some brands are more extensive than others, another thing we'll talk about later on. But ultimately, what happens is it's a cat and mouse game of software is released, a vulnerability is found, an update patches it out. A vulnerability is found, a patch updates it out. And this carries on for perpetuity. Now, when it comes to network attached storage devices, these are systems that are on 24/7. They're often utilized for home or business use, but a lot of the time, they're not updated as much as they should be. No brand has automatic updates on their system. And if it did, I don't think everyone would be happy about that. Anyone that's kept clicking away that they don't want to upgrade to Windows 11, or yes, I know there's an Android update, will you please just go away? Well, understand that not everyone likes to install new updates because it changes things. Some things might stop working, and lots of other reasons. And in the case of NAS, they don't want the NAS to have to shut down and reboot, potentially changing some dynamic IPs that people still use and more, as well as suspending access. So a lot of the time, and there are users out there that don't even know there's updates, these systems do not get updated. And because there's so many different updates out there is a wider range of firmwares there to play with. When the initial big hit of Deadbolt happened to QNAP, I believe in January, I think it was January 14th, but I might be wrong, of 2022, there was reported at the time over 3,000 users hit by that. That was 3,000 reported users, and we'll get onto the subject of reported users later on. Now with that number has, it's never been that high again, but every few months, Deadbolt happens again, and then it happens again, and the number got smaller and smaller and smaller. The reason being, and again, this is still not 100% confirmed, and still a good chunk of this has to be hypothesis and evidential, or just read in the room, but a lot of that is because people were missed in that first wave. Either they didn't have their systems internet connected at that point, either they did have it internet connected, but at that time the security settings were better or worse than they were, or they were simply just missed, or their network was just having a good day or a bad day. But either way, the continued attacks afterwards, one of the more persistent variables was it kept attacking the older firmware because the firmware hadn't updated. Now again, that number got smaller and smaller, and then all of a sudden we've seen it come back up again, and the reason being because this new vulnerability has been found in an app that's running within Photo Station. And again, if you think people don't update their OS enough on a NAS, you should see how few people actually update the individual applications. So what we see once again is an app arriving, a vulnerability found, and so on and so forth, but with a tremendous range of software updates being attacked by these individuals, all based on Linux, and all of these NAS systems based on the same build in a way, and a very similar architecture when it comes down to the pure Lego bricks themselves. And that is why after the QNAP attack, we saw an Acer Store Deadbolt attack. We saw a TerraMaster Deadbolt attack this year because of that methodology in Linux, and of course, release, replace, release, replace. Now, again, moving slightly away from Deadbolt, ransomware attacks and malware attacks, and particularly people trying to exploit security vulnerabilities in software, is not uncommon. All, and I do mean all, the NAS brands have been hit by them in one shape or form. And if you're thinking Synology is bulletproof, they're not. Synolocker, they were hit by a ransomware attack as well. Now, when it comes to the nature of being hit by ransomware attacks and the very nature of your platform, a lot of brands have to make a very difficult choice, and they have to choose between making their system as rigid and secure and slightly less flexible in order to maintain that, or give users flexibility. And I think this is a juggling act that QNAP has clearly not, got right here. But I think we need to examine a little bit further now into what is QNAP's fault and what isn't QNAP's fault here. So straight away, I'm going to try to stay on the fence here as much as possible, but let's be realistic. I'm in a room with at least 2 QNAP NASs near me, and I talk about NAS all the time. So it's going to be incredibly hard to at least appear neutral to you, and indeed look at these things as objective as someone that's only buying one for the very first time. So straight away, let's look at the areas where QNAP are at fault objectively. Number one, it does not feel like they security test their apps enough. I still maintain that the real issue here, more than anything, is about the external doorway or means of connecting these devices to the internet, but there is still absolutely no disregarding the fact that their applications do not seem to go through the rigorous testing that we think they should. And ultimately, if we do have a system where the applications themselves can have the odd hole poked through them, the result is that if that front door gives way, the bad guys can get anywhere in our system. And Photo Station, in many ways it was fortunate that it was Photo Station, given that most users have migrated over to QMAGI, a superior photo platform, although many still use Photo Station for photography reasons. It has a few config options built into it, which obviously means it still exists. But still, the users using both of those, QNAP should have done something about that. QNAP should have at least emulated the security protocol of one to the other, or at the very least, much like they do with their surveillance platform with QVR Elite and QVR Pro, make one choice or the other. And I still don't think that would have solved this, but this is just another example of just a tremendous number of applications on the QNAP platform, which are just too many to stay on top of there. And consequently, it just doesn't feel like these applications are arriving fully ready. We're seeing more and more applications from QNAP arriving in beta, and I get it. A beta application is a beta, and when you do use a beta, it does give you a warning on screen. But again, this is still an app that may have holes that are punchable in it, and I just don't feel, looking at the catalogue, that QNAP is spending as much time on security testing and pen testing of their system and services on those individual applications in system that they could. Another thing, and again, I talked about this earlier on, and this is a perspective shift, and I have my own opinion about this, which I'm obviously going to tell you now, is forced updates. Not everyone likes them, and I'll be honest with you, I'm talking to you now, while just before recording, my Windows laptop off screen there has an update that I've not installed there. So again, look at me, the big old contrarian and absolute hypocrite. But the fact still remains that when you are using these systems, it's not like using a web browser. It's not like using a Word doc here. This is a storage system. I don't think I should be allowed to connect this externally without one of two things. I want, one, a minimum security level. I don't want to be able to connect this to the internet unless I have met certain security criteria. They've included obviously tools, which I'll talk on about in a moment, but still nonetheless, I shouldn't be allowed to connect this to the internet without severe, or at least recommended, security settings in place already on there. And the same goes for updates as well. I think updates should have be automatic. I think they should be forced. You should have a system where it doesn't force your system to reboot on the fly without you knowing, but it should say to you, an update has come out. If you do not install this new update, in 3 days you won't be able to remote access your system. Something like that. That was one of the things that QNAP got in a lot of trouble with during the very first wave of Deadbolt attacks, when they forced an update on everyone's system to patch out the vulnerability there. And the problem there lied, they didn't give anyone any warning. What they did was they pushed out the update to the systems, and these were systems that by and large had auto-update in one shape or form then. It just forced the trigger, but still nonetheless, that was not a great way to announce that. They could at the very least said, we are going to do this in a day or so. Understandably, they may not have done that because of hackers thinking we better make the most of our exploit, but, you know, you can't win on these things. But still nonetheless, my personal feeling is I shouldn't be allowed to connect these devices to the internet without at least a system of checkboxes that confirm, by checking the system, that I have done or arranged certain things that I'll talk about at the end of the video that I consider settings that you should enable. And more importantly, when it comes to enabling access, even if you want to ignore those and you just want to allow access, you haven't got your phone, you don't want to enable two-step, you want to use the admin account, maybe you do want to tunnel in via SSH, fine, then it should have a big old message on screen that goes, you are doing this at your own risk. TrueNAS does a great job at that. Whenever you try to do anything on a TrueNAS where it is against the advisory control panel of the system, although it's an incredibly complex platform, if you try to do something that isn't recommended, it really makes you work for it. It makes you force past the alerts, makes you force past any kind of barrier where it's saying you really shouldn't do this. And that's something I think QNAP could stand to learn from. The next thing is those tools, and this is sort of about my second point there. This is another thing that I believe QNAP is at fault for here, and that is they are providing malware tools, they are providing firewall tools, they have links to antivirus tools there. You've got the security check system there, and a security counselor as well, and an advisory that goes and scans your whole system. It tells you all of that, and then it goes, well, you could change 7 things there. Bye. And then it walks off. No, You shouldn't be allowed to have all of those tools and then be allowed to ignore them. Again, maybe you disagree with me, maybe you say, right, I want to be able to know where my loopholes are and be done with it. Fine. But in that case, there should be a giant warning that goes, go no further. If you do so, you're at your own risk. Because that's one of the other problems here. Giving people all of this flexibility, then giving them all the tools to scan for vulnerabilities and finding out where those vulnerabilities can be and suggesting recommendations on changing that, and then not enforcing them. And I think there's a line where the brand can say, oh, no, we've given you all the ability to do whatever you want. We're going to be over there. I don't think you can market your product to more novice users and still have that mindset. Now, I'm going to come across a point in a bit that sounds contrary to that, but it isn't, trust me. But now, let's move on to the other side of the fence. What about the end user? Where does their responsibility end, or more importantly, where does it begin? Again, I try to remain as neutral and on the fence as possible about this because I appreciate I have someone that has access to hardware, but I'm sorry, you're not allowed to complain about not having a backup in place like it's not your fault. Right now, you can't, we live in an internet age where we create data alarmingly fast, and a lot of it is crucial to us, from banks information to photos that are our keepsakes and more. We aren't allowed to say, well, I thought this was a backup. No, you're not allowed to say that now, because right now, as mentioned in the intro, if you move a lot of data from your laptop and a bunch of other devices onto your NAS and then delete it from all of those, you're not allowed to call that a backup because you didn't call it a backup when it was on your laptop, when there was only one copy there. So it's not a backup when there's only one copy there. And there's a lot of users that have been hit by this. And again, in those cases, in a case-by-case basis, sometimes it's QNAP's fault, sometimes it's the user's fault, sometimes it's both faults. But when it comes to the responsibility of your own backups, there are multiple applications there for you to take advantage of. Yes, I think QNAP should be a lot more forceful about how it allows you to proceed moving forward without a backup in place, but you can't say that the necessary tools aren't there. And you can't blame cost either, because if you're going to go to the trouble of spending a lot of money on a network attached storage system because you thought spending money on the cloud was tossing money in the bin, then I'm afraid you've at least understood the value of money. And if you're getting one of these, the very least you can do is get a USB drive to connect to it and periodically back up the files from it and stick that in a drawer, or get a cloud storage account, get some free cloud storage. But right now, you cannot point at any NAS brand, QNAP in this case, or any of them, if they fail and say, you said it was a backup. It was capable of a backup, and that's what's important. The next thing is actioning updates. I've mentioned that as well, about I believe personally that the brands should enforce and should auto and download updates to their systems for you to install on there. Hell, all of these NAS brands, when you set them up for the first time, recommend that as well. And right now, users, and again, hypocrite here included, do have updates to their system they need to install. And a lot of users are choosing not to install those updates, which, again, once you start with that mindset, that's you at fault. Because with all of this going on, yes, brands can secure their applications, but when it comes down to an application being released and then maintained and updated over time, at that point, from release, the brand is trying to do as many updates as it can. And if you choose not to install those updates, therefore you are not getting those security patches, you shouldn't be wholly unsurprised if you fall victim to a vulnerability when these nefarious individuals are attacking all of the old versions as much as they can in order to find and exploit those vulnerabilities. And moreover, if you do this and then connect this thing to the internet, no way. And that leads me to my third reason why I don't think QNAP is at fault here. The age of internet ignorance is over. We're not allowed to be ignorant of the internet anymore. We are not our grandparents. We're not even our parents anymore. We can't just pretend that, oh no, the internet got in. It's not fair. I didn't think it would do that. Yes, you did. You did. And it's a lot of users who have been hit by this. And again, this is not me not sympathising with people who have been hit by Deadbolt. It is rubbish. These should not be doing this, but at the same time, you can't claim that you were doing everything you can or your system was set up in good faith when you know in your heart of hearts you connected it with the internet and hoped for the best. And that does not mean all users. I'm talking a small percentage of users who are impacted in that way. It's very clear to see that when you are connecting something to the internet and all of your data is on it, that is not a difficult line of questioning there to understand the risk. And I think a lot of users who are connecting these things to the internet may want to sit there and think about how much time they spent setting this up and not thinking about the router in the middle there. Which leads me to the recommendations that I would say that you need to make on your NAS system. And yes, in the case of this video, I'm most certainly talking about QNAP. But you know what? Even if you don't own a QNAP, a lot of the points I'm going to make right now, you could stand to keep note of. Obviously, get your updates for both your applications and the system as a whole on auto download there and install. But on top of that, make sure that admin account is disabled. These days, I don't quite understand why anyone would still have the admin account accessible and at the same time have remote access. I will get onto a way around that though. Next, disable UPnP on your router. Yes, when it comes to the NAS, you may be utilizing it on a local area network and there are ways and means, but when it comes to your router, disable that one, because unless you are using particular smart home appliances that require use of an off-site IoT server, or you are utilizing some distant multimedia capabilities, and even then you can be very selective about port forwarding there. It should be said that I would disable that, particularly on ISP routers, which are incredibly rudimentary and regularly hit for vulnerabilities worldwide. Next up, disabling SSH and Telnet. If you don't know what they are, hopefully they are already disabled by default, but a lot of users go into these systems and install a lot of applications on day one, and there's actually a few apps on QNAP's range of applications there that require that level of access in order to get the command line. So make sure they are disabled there, and make sure also that you are putting on an SSL certificate. It's very easy to do. You can get a Let's Encrypt absolutely free, and that allows and makes sure that the transmission communication with the NAS is encrypted and makes it a great deal more secure. Next up, randomize your ports when you're setting up the device for the first time. Not so much the IP there, but the external port there. Randomize it. There will be a default number, and for some reason we still don't use randomized ports by default. It will be a preset, so you can change that in the settings menu very, very easily. We did a whole video showing you how to change a number of these settings. Hopefully that will be linked in the article in the description. Next, you hear it all the time, get a VPN. VPNs are not expensive now. They're super cheap and they're widely supported. Even if you get a VPN that is not on one of the preset profiles of QNAP NAS, there are a number out there that already have got the authentication key and all of the downloadables that you can just import to the NAS, export over to the NAS very, very easily there, and that will allow an encrypted tunnel to the NAS itself. Next up, only give external access to the NAS on preset apps. Let me finish. But with those preset apps, create their own defined user. Now, what I mean by that is, if you are using multimedia capabilities with things like Plex remotely, then create a Plex user account and allow only that user and only that app to have the access, and therefore you can scale down the level of access that that user account has if that one does, fall to a vulnerability. Plex themselves were hit by a data hack a couple of weeks ago, and that wasn't a ransomware, but they obtained lots of users' login information there. Now imagine that login information allowed them to access your server via the Plex app. How much credentials you gave to that user and Plex now becomes questionable. So that's another reason when it comes to you, if you're going to give an app internet access, internet facing setup there, make sure you create another user for that, and then that user account there that grants you access to those privileges, scale down its user credentials and abilities within your NAS system accordingly there to isolate that. Again, TrueNAS does a very good job of that when it's using jails there, when it comes to actioning different applications and services there. And obviously enable two-step verification, very, very important, because although two-step verification can be a bit finicky and also is very adaptable to different access and use patterns of the system and those applications, it has to be said that two-step at its very least allows you to slam a door down on a lot of first-party applications in a very, very, very thorough way there. But that is a handful of ways in which you can secure your system. But even then, if you're doing all of these without a backup in place, you're doing it wrong. And before you connect this system to the internet, and whether that is you're using front-face remote portal access, or you're using My QNAP Cloud and therefore bouncing for a QNAP third-party, QNAP first-party server with encrypted tunnels between, which is a bugger for terrible performance, but it's a great deal more secure. One way or another, however you're going to do it, have a backup first. Have your updates in place and have them automatically update into their heart's content first. And ultimately, although I don't think we're going to hear the last of Deadbolt now for a while, and given this vulnerability, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear it hitting another brand sometime soon. Ultimately, these are the best things you can do, and make sure that your outside door, the front door to your storage, is as secure as possible. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. There's a whole article breaking down the latest ransomware attack, along with all of the stuff I've covered today, and links as well in the description, so check that out. Thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to stay abreast of these events, and use the free advice section and Ask NAS Compares as we cover this and many subjects in storage, and you can find the answer to your questions there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.